Good evening and welcome to this exclusive Telegraph subscriber online event, How to Eat and Drink for Better Gut Health, which is the final event in our January Health Reset series. My name is Sharon Walker and I'm the Health Features Editor for the Telegraph, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. Before we get started, I'd just like to remind you, if you wish to submit questions, please pop them in the Q&A box below the video, and I'll try to tackle as many as possible. Please include your first name if possible so I can see who the questions come from. So we're here today to talk about gut health, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined this evening by Professor Tim Spector, OBE. Tim is an absolute world-leading expert in this subject and one of our most quoted scientists. He is co-founder of Zoe Limited, the personalised nutrition programme, which is also the world's largest study investigating how our foods impact our body. Added to that, Tim is also the author of 4 popular science books, including Food for Life and The Science of Eating Well. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Tim.
It's a pleasure.
So we've got a lot of content to get through this evening. So I think we should just jump straight in by asking you exactly what we mean by gut health and why it's so important.
Gut health, yeah, it's what I've been banging on for over a decade about. It's the health of our gut microbes, this community of bugs that live in our lower intestine that are actually, there's more of these microbes than there are cells in our body. So we're actually slightly more microbe than human. And if you put them all together, they weigh about the same as a human brain. And they consist of bacteria, they consist of viruses which eat those bacteria, there's fungi, there's parasites, all kinds of stuff going on, thousands of different species. And essentially it's like we've discovered in the last few years a new organ in our bodies, a virtual organ, just like we have another liver. And best way I think to think about the role of these microbes, which we used to think were bad and only gave us diarrhea and problems when we're traveling, is as mini pharmacies. They are pumping out chemicals day long, all the time. The main chemicals we need for our body to function well, they're produced, most of them, vast majority, by these microbes. So that's the way to think about them, and that's why it's important to feed them right. And if you feed them right, they pump out the right chemicals that then interact with crucial bits of our body, and the most, obviously our brain they communicate with, and can send out neurochemicals that stop you getting depressed. They influence your immune system, which is key to so many processes in our body, because most of the immune cells are actually lining the gut, and so they're always talking to each other, and that stops you getting allergies, it stops autoimmune diseases, it prevents infections like COVID, it is also good at surveillance against cancer and preventing aging. Then you've got, what we used to think was the sort of key stuff, but now is just peripheral, is actually our metabolism, our energy maintenance, maintaining a stable weight, not putting on too fat, changing your appetite levels when you eat right or you eat the bad foods. So, that's just a tiny amount of what they really do. And these are pumping out vitamins as well. Many of the B vitamins are only produced by your gut microbes. But for it to work well, you've got to look after it, like you would your garden or, some tropical forest. And so that's really the way to think about it. And if you start thinking about that, you start to think about food in a completely different way.
Right. So what should we be doing to look after them well? What should we be feeding our gut microbes?
Well, there are a few basic principles, and I obviously go into it much more detail in the books, but very briefly, give yourself plenty of different plants every week. So we've come up with this figure of 30 different plants from some studies we did, diverse, and that includes nuts and seeds and berries and herbs and spices. So
30 sounds like a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's not just types of kale, spinach and Brussels sprouts. It's lots of little things that you can add in easily, and and we can discuss those those details. But it's not nearly as hard when you embrace it, and if you move away from the very rather dull traditional English food of meat and 2 veg to a sort of more Mediterranean or Middle Eastern style, then it actually becomes pretty easy to do that. And you just got to bear in mind, let's give my microbes something new to eat every day.
Yeah, because that's one of the main things, isn't it? That we've got to not just eat the same 2 veg and 2 bits of fruit every day.
Yeah, people get into, they think, oh, I'm super healthy. I have my prawn salad every day. I go to, Pret or whatever it is, for the supermarket, and you get what you think is healthy. But if you have the same thing every day, that's pretty dull for your gut microbes. They get pretty sick of that, and only a few species will like it. And the rest of them are dwindling around just waiting for you to eat something different. Right? They're begging, please give us something different on our plate. So that diversity is key. Second rule is, when you're picking your plants and what to eat, go for colour. Eat the rainbow because they've got these important polyphenol chemicals in them. These defence chemicals that give you those bright colours are also the same ones that protect the plant and against wind and predators, etc. And we used to call them antioxidants, but now we used that word because we didn't really know what they did. But now they're all called polyphenols. There are thousands of them, and they're used as fuel by your gut microbes. So it really energizes them and enables them to multiply, etc. So they love that diversity of the fiber and the different types of food. They also like the color and the bitterness, and that's important. The third rule is fermented foods, and many people they've said, oh yeah, I have the odd yogurt a couple of times a week, but you should be having some fermented food every day to really engage your gut microbes. And yes, it can be yogurt, but make sure it's pure full fat. It's not stuck with lots of sugar and bits of artificial fruit and artificial sweeteners and stuff. But then you've got cheeses, and we're not talking about the cheeses that last for 6 months. We're talking about, real traditional cheese is the best.
So when you say that not the cheese that lasts for 6 months, they're not the normal cheddar that you stick in your toasted cheese sandwich?
Well, most of that actually does contain bacteria because if it goes off, right? If it goes off and it goes, has mold growing on it, it's fine. But there are some cheeses like Kraft slices that I've kept on my shelf for 2 years.
They're not really cheeses, are they?
They're not really cheeses. They're sterile cheeses.
Yeah.
That's what I meant. So it's those artificial ones, those frozen cheeses you often get in cheap pizzas. They don't really count. So getting better quality cheeses. Then you've got fermented milks, kefirs, which are increasingly popular around the country now. I generally tell people to go for the plain ones rather than the ones that add lots of fruits in it.
Okay. So they're okay if you buy, because I was like, oh, I just can't be asked to brew my own kefir and put in little bits. I just won't get round to it.
It's very easy, by the way.
I know it's very easy. I know it's very easy.
I
know it's very easy. I'm sure it is, but but I've just started buying the bottles from the supermarket, and then I was like, am I wasting my money? Is this it does say it's got live bacteria, but they're okay, are they?
But if they've got too much sugar in it, it can counteract the good bacteria. So generally, as a rule for all fermented foods, go for as natural, least things in it possible, and you can add your own. Then you know exactly what's gone into it, because that's the problem. And avoid things with very long shelf lives, because then generally they'll put in other preservatives and things. So the fermented foods is but don't forget there's plenty of others. We haven't got time to discuss them all, but all this stuff is in the book. You've got fermented tea, kombucha, which is, super powerful, and things like what we're talking about now, the kefirs, the kombuchas,
What's kombucha exactly?
It's fermented tea.
Tea, okay.
So basically, you just brew up a whole lot of tea. You add 6 really big spoonfuls of sugar.
Is that the thing with the Scooby in it?
And you have a SCOBY, yes.
Scooby, not Scooby.
Which is basically a blob, looks like some alien. And if you get a good kombucha from the shop, it should have a little tiny sediment in the bottom. If you grow it up at home, feed it some tea and sugar, you should become a blob.
So if you buy a shop book,
that's how I started.
Kombucha from a supermarket, you can get the what's it called, the mother, is it the sediment from the bottom, and then what do? You put it in water with
just
sugar?
Some tea and some tea.
Oh, tea and sugar.
It likes tea, like most British people. It likes tea. It likes very sugary tea, and it then converts it, and it grows into this this substance which is basically a colony of about 30 different microbes, and they grow this thick leather-like substance that can be up to about 2 centimeters thick. And I've got these horrendous things in my fridge that look like they come out of Doctor Who or something, but they are incredible, and they're incredibly tough, and you can freeze them. They last in your fridge for years, and they still seem to recover, and they have like 6 times as many microbes or 10 times as many microbes as your general yogurt, as does kefir. So all these things, yogurt's the sort of standard one, and yogurt and cheese usually have 3 or 4 different microbes. Then you move on, and these ones have often 10 or sometimes 30 different types of microbes, yeasts, fungi. And even better is you've got the other K. So the way to remember this is, get my K's in there. Is kimchi, which is a general umbrella word for any sort of chopped fermented vegetables that you put in a salt solution, and dead easy to make, as long as you don't care exactly what the ingredients are, with all kinds of 6 different vegetables in brine. Just the microbes are on the vegetable, and it just ferments it itself. Then you've got sauerkraut. Most people know sauerkraut. That's just cabbage in brine, and it just softens and ferments. So there's lots of different ones out there. There's also water kefirs if people don't like milk. So there's pretty much a choice, a great choice. And kombucha is a really good choice for people giving up alcohol, because it's got a really strong taste, and there's lots of different flavors. I love hops ones, and but be aware any of these ones, if they've got too much sugar or they've got artificial sweeteners in it, you should generally
So just check the label and make sure sugar's not up there.
Yeah, and the final 2, so they're the 3 things. So 30 plants, have the rainbow, fermented foods. Then your 4th tip is give your gut a rest, and try and not snack late at night, and try and give yourself at least a 12-hour overnight fast, ideally 14.
So I've read recent research that 7 p.m. is a good cut-off point for us not eating anymore. Is that something you agree with?
There's lots of detailed research of people doing clinical trials in labs and things, and they work out that yes, ideally, when you take young people, if you feed them early on, start at 7 in the morning and you finish at, or 9 in the morning and you stop at 7, and they have nothing after 6 or 7, that's ideally the best for the metabolism. But the question is, can you actually continue that for the rest of your life?
It's not very practical, is it, if you're working?
Not much good for a social life either, right? So you can't eat or drink other than tea or black tea or coffee in that time. So most people find it's easy, and we did this study on the Zoe Health Study app, which everyone can download for free, and I think you can still do it, where we had 140,000 people said, I'm going to try this intermittent fasting, try to eat in a 10-hour window, and most people managed it, but most people preferred to eat late. So there's a bit of personal preference here, and this comes back to this recurring theme of my research, is this personalisation.
Right.
There isn't one size fits all for everybody. We've got to find out what works for us that is sustainable, and this is what we're in January. This is all very much a time of working out not just something that's going to last a few weeks. It's what little change can you do that's going to last. So try it. Everyone should try it. Some people find it really easy. Some people actually miss out. They like to nibble a lot, and so there's always some people it doesn't work for. So don't worry. But give it a go. I found it amazing, and I don't do it every day, but most days, I have either a late breakfast or I skip my breakfast. And finally, no surprise really, cut down or get rid of as much as possible of ultra-processed foods because of the extra chemicals in them.
So what do you mean? What kind of things are ultra-processed foods? I mean, is it sort of anything that you don't buy in a fishmonger or a butcher or a...
Well, you can buy all sorts of things. It's things that come in packets that can be anything from sliced bread which may look healthy, but if you look at the ingredients, it's often got over 10 ingredients, most chemicals you don't recognize. It's things you couldn't make at home from raw ingredients.
Right.
It has lots of definitions, but so one is the number of ingredients. It's got too many ingredients, be highly suspicious of it. If it's made from extracts of other plants, so it doesn't actually have any of the original plant in it, it's all a combination of extracts stuck together. So corn on the cob would be an unprocessed food, but cornflakes would be an ultra-processed food because there's nothing of the original the whole plants in that cornflake. It's all the extracts that they've stuck together, and they've stripped all the goodness out, and they add in back vitamins and things like that.
Yeah, and they often sell it to you as a health food then, don't they, with all the added vitamins?
Correct. So most of these ultra-processed foods will have labels that fool you into thinking they're good for you and your gut, and they're the exact opposite, and you should avoid them. So there's no general rules about this, and it's really impossible to give up all ultra-processed foods. We're very dependent on, and I still like the occasional bag of crisps or quavers or whatever it is. And but if you're doing pretty well the rest of the time, your gut microbes can handle it. But if you're having it all the time, I think that's one reason that our guts suffer, and also gives those microbes signals from the artificial sweeteners, from the glue, the emulsifiers, from this other stuff that we still don't know, sends hunger signals to increase us to eat more of the stuff.
So the chemicals in the ultra-processed food are actually making us eat more of them, is that what you're saying?
They're brilliantly designed to be tasty, last forever, and you can always notice a bread, ultra-processed bread that will, last for weeks.
Yeah, because you don't think of bread as being ultra-processed, but obviously lots of them are.
Well, because it's heavily disguised behind dyes that make it look nice and brown, and labels that are deceptive. But that's a good example that I found I wasn't aware of before I started studying it. And most of the bread we have is very unhealthy, doesn't have really enough fibre in it for us, and too many other ingredients that that will irritate our gut microbes. And not having enough fibre means that the sugar ratio is high, so that we'll get blood sugar spikes, which is long-term bad for us and cause inflammation. So choosing your bread carefully, ideally going for homemade sourdough, or good sourdoughs, eating less of it, but paying more for it, particularly if it's high in fibre, or things like rye, which are digested much more slowly.
So rye is better than wheat bread? Yes.
Just because it generally has a higher fibre content, it's a heavier bread, and it's got more of the original ingredients in it.
So is fibre one of the key things that we're looking for to feed our gut microbes?
Yes, that's what they depend on. They like the original bits of the plant. They don't want just that pure, highly refined bit on the inside, which hardly ever gets to them. So when you're eating this stuff, if it's highly refined wheat, it gets absorbed high up in the gut and gets into the bloodstream. It doesn't go down to the microbes, so they're essentially starving. So having things high in fibre, relatively low in sugar, as a ratio is the way forward. And it means everything's a bit slower, and so also gives you time for the signals of hunger to click in.
So one of the questions that we've had from a few people, and Tina has mentioned this, is that how can we tell what kind of shape our gut's in, or our gut microbes are in? Is there a cheap and easy test that we can do at home?
Well, we know that the average state of the UK gut is pretty bad. On average, we've lost about half of our gut microbes compared to our ancestors 100 years ago. And
how do we know that?
Well, by comparing lots of other populations around the world. Obviously, I didn't keep samples in my fridge for the last 100 years, but we're assuming this because if you go to hunter-gatherer tribes or other places in Africa, you'll see a greater variety of microbes than we have now. And so we believe, and also if you look at ancient remains of people who've fallen into crevasses 4,000 years ago, etc., and various other archaeological methods, it's fairly clear that up to quite recently we had a real full complement of gut microbes, but modern living, it's down to about half. So it's very important we hang on to what we've got and try and get more back. And so we're all, compared to hunter-gatherers, we're all doing quite badly. But even within the UK, there's quite a big range.
Right.
And so the ideal way is to do a genetic test, sort of test you get done at Zoe, where you get a kit which measures using the genes in all the microbes and then identifies them. But that costs money at the moment, and so a cheap way to do that is to look at your transit time. How long does it take for food to go from your mouth down to the toilet, essentially? And we did this study doing the Zoe Predict studies. We gave several thousand people a bright blue muffin and told them to see how long it took. And the average in the UK was about 28 hours for it to pass through. But the range was about 12 hours to about 5 days.
All right, 5 days, wow.
And people vary quite a lot. We all have very different lengths of intestines and metabolisms, etc. But generally, if your transit time is long, you're going to have less diverse microbes. They'll be in a poorer state, and you'll be. We've correlated it as a crude way of doing it. So there is a test you can do called the Blue Poop Challenge, and if you go to the website, the joinzoe.com website, there's details of how you can take part in that. And just for the price of a bit of a food dye, you can test you and your family's gut health pretty well. The other signs are if you end up with bloating. A lot of people have irritable bowel syndrome or just mild symptoms of bloating and pain after meals. Intermittent constipation is another sign. They're all signs of poor gut health. And we've clearly linked more extreme types of those conditions with a lack of diversity of your gut microbes. So they're the easy way to do it. And generally in this country, we just don't eat enough fibre, we don't have enough diversity, we don't have enough fermented foods.
So the key thing is to increase the variety in your diet, to increase...
Yeah, I mean, my view is that if you can aim for, I don't always do it every single week, but if you aim for something like 30 plants, just naturally, and it includes nuts and seeds and berries and things like this, you're naturally going to get enough fibre in that diet without having to sort of count everything. Because as you know, I'm very much against counting things like calories.
Yeah. I saw one great tip on the Zoe app, which I think it was from you, where you'd filled up a jar with lots of different seeds and nuts and sprinkled them on your food. So that's a good way of getting...
Yeah, there's lots of hacks to, people always ask me about how do you get your 30 a week? And I say, well, it's dead easy. You just cheat. You have a jar, and every time you go to any shop that sells mixed nuts or some nut or seed that you haven't seen before, you buy it and you add it to your jar. So your jar can have a dozen different plants in it, which every morning I, will sprinkle on my yogurt or my salads. And, just on day one of the week, I've suddenly done my 12 plants. And, and also you need to think more broadly, what is a plant? Okay, so we've talked nuts, seeds, herbs, spices, adding spice mix to any dish to make it, more Mexican or more Middle Eastern or more Asian, gives you your microbes a boost as well, because it's super concentrated, the polyphenols in those bits. The other tricks are also realizing that other things are plants. Chocolate is a plant.
That's good news.
Yeah. Okay, so
there has to be dark chocolate, doesn't it?
It's a fermented bean.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm talking about the pure, in its pure form, 100% chocolate. That is just eating a fermented plant. Very important. Now, I say you can go up for any from 70% to 100%, and that counts for me. All right. Right. The other surprising plant is, of course, coffee.
Yes,
it's
quite a
fermented.
few people have asked about that actually. We had one person write in and saying, is coffee something that's off limits or is that okay?
Well, I've been saying this for the last 10 years. All the epidemiological evidence suggests that coffee, which used to be the demon, we were told it gives you heart attacks and the caffeine's terrible for you, you're going to drop dead if you have too much. Turns out the opposite is true. We got it completely wrong, and it reduces heart attacks, it increases your longevity. And up to about 5 cups is actually fine. That doesn't mean it works for everybody. Everything I say always has some exceptions, because people always, email me and sort of phone up and said, oh, not true if in this case. Absolutely. But in the trials, coffee drinkers live longer than non-coffee drinkers or tea drinkers.
And you're not talking about lattes there, are you, or are you?
Any coffee.
So it
includes even decaffeinated coffee.
Okay.
So it's not the caffeine, it's the plant. It's the fermented plant that has all these defense chemicals in it, these polyphenols. And if you have like 3 or more cups of coffee, that's a substantial amount of fibre. So that's about 1/3 of the UK's amount of fibre that you're actually ingesting as well. So that's why people need to think more. That's why I'm trying to get people to think of food in a different way. Our old idea that, coffee was bad, orange juice good, actually it's completely the opposite. And this is true when we start thinking about food in a very different way from just calories and sugar and vitamins. And we start thinking about it in terms of, is it good or bad for our gut health?
So one question that came in, now we're talking about tea and coffee, was from a subscriber called David, and he's asked which herbal teas are best for our gut. Is there
Green matcha tea.
Green matcha tea, okay.
Is probably the one. There's some evidence that real mint teas do have some effect on the gut if you have gut problems, digestive problems, but it doesn't seem to be any sort of boost.
Right.
So it might help some temporary symptoms, but I think matcha green tea is the one to go for. And that's much better. So green tea is actually much better than traditional black English tea, which has some polyphenols, but about 1/4 of the benefits of coffee.
Yeah, I mean, I often read that green tea is anti-cancer. Is that something that...
There's some evidence on that, that people who drink green tea and there's some evidence that coffee actually can reduce cancer, but the data is not as clear-cut as it is for heart disease.
And do we need to, this is a question from another subscriber called Barbara, do we need to eat organic? Is that something important for our gut?
It probably is, and the reasons to eat organic are mainly to reduce the amount of herbicides and pesticides you're getting on your plants. So as if you're like me, you're trying to increase the number of plants in your diet, you do end up eating a lot of vegetables that in this country are sprayed routinely with things like glyphosate, Roundup and other products to get rid of insects, get rid of weeds, and to dry it out before we eat it. So many oat breakfast cereals have huge amounts of these pesticides. It's not proven that they're bad for you epidemiologically. There are a few case studies in America. Some people have successfully sued companies for this. I would say if you can afford it, and they are more expensive, definitely go for it. And if you're worried about that cost, focus for pregnant women and young children.
Right.
Then I think there is more evidence of a biological effect. So we're still lacking data on that. So it's one of those ones where you try and do it, but I'm not quite sure how, the exact benefit to risk.
Right, right. And one thing that you've touched on already, which is weight loss diets. And is there something, what's the impact of, I don't know, it's quite a lot of them are quite exclude food groups, for example, like keto. Can you say how the impact might be on our gut health or things like that?
Yeah, well, obviously there's generally calorie counting and calorie restriction diets don't work. Okay, for 95% of people, unless you've got something specifically wrong with you, they don't work. The body
even
is
in the
designed.
short term, sort of thing.
Well, yes, for a few weeks they work.
Yeah.
So if you want to get into a new dress or something, and that's your only objective, that's fine. But your body's designed to get that weight back. Your hunger levels will go up, your metabolism goes down. It gets increasingly harder to maintain that, and most people bounce back above where they were. And that's why people who do serial diets end up more overweight than people who don't bother in the first place. So purely focusing on calories is the wrong way to go. And this is why we're trying to, my philosophy and that of Zoe is to try and change people from the inside, make yourself healthy on the inside rather than worrying about, I've got an extra inch of fat I want to get rid of, therefore you go to calories. So calorie counting has been proven not to work, and I think that's really important. But the other thing about calorie counting is it detracts away from the actual food you're eating, the quality of the food, these whole plants, and gut health. And
yeah, I've heard you say quite often that we should be counting chemicals, not calories.
Exactly. So, our food is made up of tens of thousands of chemicals, which are natural. But if people looked on packets and counted up the chemical ingredients on ultra-processed foods, and they should be looking at those more than they should be the packet that says this is low calorie, has 200 calories less than this other stuff. Because it's been proven that if you eat ultra-processed food even if it's low calorie, you will overeat by 500 calories that day compared to identical meal prepared at home. So it is going to make you hungrier, although you think you're counting those calories. So it works short term, bad long term. The other thing is it restricts your diet. So as you mentioned, many people do this and they say, I'm going on a special diet or a liquid diet that's low carb, high fat, or it's non-gluten free, or it's keto. All of these work short term, but long term you're generally depriving yourself of that diversity, so your gut health will suffer, and you'll pay for it a few months down the line, because your gut will be even in a worse state and pumping out the wrong chemicals, creating this sort of stressful situation for your body, the inflammation. So by all means, if people want to do it for short-term gain, but realize that long-term it's a complete sucker's game, and that's where the diet industry makes all its money. So
if I'm sure there's going to be people that might be wanting to lose weight, especially at this time of the year. So are you saying the best way to do that? What would be the best way to do that?
Well, reduce your expectations that I've suddenly got to lose, 2 stone in the next 2 months. It's about changing your habits so you can slowly reduce weight and keep it off. Right. We now know very clearly that things like exercise don't help you lose weight. They're very good for you, don't help you lose weight though. So try looking at what you eat and the quality of the food you eat. Try and eat for your gut, and that will long-term help you lose weight by following those simple rules. Because if you're eating whole plants rather than highly refined, ultra-processed foods, you'll be getting less sugar peaks, you'll be getting less inflammation, and you'll be getting less hunger pangs. And if these studies of 2 weeks of ultra-processed against healthy foods are the same long-term, this would mean that just by switching even identical calories but actually getting better quality food, you will lose weight.
So it's about intuitive eating. I hear, just eat when we're hungry, don't ignore your hunger pangs.
Yeah, I think the other thing is it's not just what you eat, it's how you eat. And I discussed, for your gut health, getting this longer resting time overnight, this intermittent fasting, where you're not changing the amounts you eat, but you're eating windows. People who do that, we've found, reduce their snacking.
Yeah, surely you end up, just because you're eating less hours, eating less calories overall, or eating less overall? Is that part
It
of the
turns
thing?
out that way, but it's not.
Yeah.
We're not telling anyone to do that. It just happens that way. That if you're permitted to eat, as we are, in this 18 hours a day, and it's seen as normal to have a biscuit before you go to bed or whatever it is, then you'll always be attracted by these snacks and these things which, we've been brainwashed to thinking are fine and healthy and tasty and part of our culture. So just by doing some of these, doing intermittent fasting just makes you think about, I'm not going to have that extra snack just before bed. I'm going to give my gut a rest. I'm not going to have that extra beer or glass of wine. It just helps. But also it smooths out your metabolism so that actually it's functioning much more efficiently. So how you eat, just as important as what you eat, as is things like sleep. And I think you've mentioned that in previous programs. Getting your sleep right also helps your appetite and your metabolism.
Yeah, can you tell me a bit more about that? What's going on with that? I mean, because if we sleep badly, I know there's research that you've shown yourself that people tend to eat a lot more the next day, or crave certain things. I mean, when you go to bed so late, and I think that's part of the thing when you have a hangover, is that you're craving that big carb breakfast.
Yes.
What's going on there? Is that sort of like?
Well, we don't understand what the brain mechanisms are, but clearly there's some primitive thing there that said, well, you must have had a really rough night. It's like you're supercharging. You must be ready for some action, like you've been, in a war or something. It's saying, yes, you need energy because you're in this stress state.
Right.
And so we know that appetite levels go up by about 20%. And on average, we've tracked tens of thousands of people with the Zoe app who can get this continuous glucose monitor for 2 weeks. So we know what's happening, and they're recording their sleep. Bad sleep means you wake up and you're more tired, you're more hungry, and you will overeat, and you'll overeat carbs. You particularly want carbs. And we've all noticed this, right? You just say, I want some nice toast. I want some comfort food. And that then, not only are you eating more of that, but it gives you an even bigger sugar spike than you would have had on a good night's sleep. So the same food gives you a bigger spike if you haven't slept well. And this all combines to then make that whole process worse, and you get into a cycle of inflammation and more overeating the next day. So all these things all sort of add up. And that's why it's important to think about, food in this way of, gut health, but also these sugar spikes and inflammation, and realize that it's all linked up. And to, reducing stress, exercising to reduce stress, but not for weight loss, and getting your sleep right and getting your meal timings right are also really vital. So, but if you follow your gut health, you feed your gut right, the rest follows. And people have got to realize the most important thing they can do for their health is to pick the right foods.
Right.
And that's something that we can do as individuals. It's not something that we should be waiting for guidance from the NHS or our GPs on. It's something we've got to take control of.
Right, and with the guidance from the NHS and the government, that's generally good advice?
It's generally bad advice. It's about 20 years out of date. They haven't caught up with anything about gut health, and it's failed miserably.
What's the bad things that they're
So they do say
suggesting?
some good things. They say try and eat more fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, so we hear
Try
5
and
a
eat
day
more
from
fibre.
them, don't we? Sort of
5 a day doesn't work.
Yeah.
It includes things like, you can have orange juice as one of your 5 a day, and many of these synthetic sort of products that you see on the supermarket shelves say part of your 5 a day, and it's ultra processed rubbish. So
Yeah, they shouldn't be allowed to label it like that, should they?
and only about 1% of the population are able to follow the government advice. Anyway, it still says eat low-fat foods, products. It says it's okay to have low-fat children's yogurt,
Yeah,
which
so
is
what's
disgusting.
wrong with low fat? What's wrong with that?
It's because they've artificially taken the fat out, and they've added sugars and other artificial chemicals to disguise that fact. And that usually it's more sugary, or they've artificial chemicals to change the mouthfeel of it. So they're going from the natural to the artificial. And there's no reason, there's no evidence now that fat levels are bad for you.
Right.
And most people, it's the other chemicals that are the problem. So there's no evidence that margarine is better for you than butter, and many of the old margarines were much worse for you than butter.
So even if you've got sort of like a cholesterol level, you don't need to really worry about your fat intake or even your saturated fat intake?
No.
No, really? Okay.
There's no evidence that if you go on a reduced fat diet, that it actually changes any of your heart attack outcomes at all.
That's really
so
interesting.
This is the problem. There was an association, but it didn't. All the studies have failed to really change people's end result. The only change is when you change from animal foods to some animal fats to plant fats.
Right.
Then you do see some change. But if you change from animal fats, which is what used to carbohydrates, which is what's still promoted a lot more than a lot of government guidelines, you actually get worse outcomes, more obesity, more heart attacks.
Yeah, and of course a low-fat diet is absolutely torturous and flavourless, joyless to eat.
Well, exactly. And I think we've got to come back to the idea that to be sustainable, it's got to be pleasant to eat. And, you know, food is there to be enjoyed in all its glory. And we just need to embrace that natural diversity that we've got, these 30,000 plants.
Yeah. So going from not natural, which is something we hear a lot about, is supplements. And Alessio has, one of our subscribers, has written in to ask, do we really need supplements? Could they actually be harmful?
Quick answer, no, we don't need supplements for most people. And I'm talking, there are always exceptions, but vast majority of the UK population doesn't need any supplements unless they're on a terrible diet. But if you have a reasonable balanced diet, you do not need any supplements, and there's no evidence to contradict, to back up that you do need supplements.
Is that also for vitamin D? Because I see the NHS, particularly in COVID, were telling us all to have vitamin D. And I know that a lot of people do get it from their doctor.
It is government policy to tell everyone to have 1 tablet of vitamin D, but there's absolutely no evidence it's beneficial. And I've studied vitamin D for 30 years. I've written 40 papers on it. I was a big fan.
Really? Okay.
And I used to take it. But it now has been shown in many studies that it doesn't even work for bone health. It doesn't reduce your risk of fractures, and you can overdose on it. So increasingly we're realizing that the way to get your vitamins are important, minerals are important. You get them from food, and you can get all the vitamin D you need from sunshine and a range of foods, nuts, seeds, and you can even get it from mushrooms if you leave them in the sun. So there's much better ways of getting all the correct things in our diet, and often it can be harmful. There's lots of evidence now. Things like calcium tablets are harmful for your heart. Vitamin A you can overdose on. Some people have overdosed on vitamin D. They don't get eliminated quickly. And you've got to think the body processes a big blob of something like calcium very differently if it's in a nut or a seed or a plant than if you're taking a gram of it all in one go. Yeah. And that's probably why they have these adverse effects. So we've been brainwashed into thinking that we need them. Unless you've got some medical problems or you can't eat a normal balanced diet, I would throw them all away.
Really? That's interesting. So even if you go to the doctor and you have your blood tested and it's through the floor for vitamin D, you just need to get outside more and change your diet?
There are always exceptions.
Right.
Rickets still occurs. Okay, so the rickets is a vitamin D deficiency that you used to see in young children. It ends up they're painful bent bones and limbs, and we are seeing that in very deprived communities. So for those people, vitamin D is a lifesaver. I'm talking about for normal people who have no symptoms, no other problems. If you've got 0 vitamin D in your blood, then yes, take a supplement. But if you're just below average, I wouldn't bother. There's no evidence that helps in these big randomized studies. So again, everything I'm saying applies to 95% of people, not this clinical group that may have a particular problem. There's some evidence some diseases like multiple sclerosis can benefit from vitamin D, so I don't want to say no for nobody, but the idea that the whole population needs it or it needs to be added to all our foods is absolute nonsense.
That's interesting. And what about with probiotics? Because that's something that a few of us subscribers have asked about. Deirdre's asked if there's any supplements that can help with bloating. Is probiotics something we should be taking? Or?
Well, probiotics, it's hard to generalise. They do work, so they do get through the gut and they're not destroyed, as some people used to believe, when you take them. But there's no real evidence they work as a prevention. And I'd much rather people took fermented foods for prevention of gut health.
Right.
But there are a number of conditions where they've been shown to work. And irritable bowel syndrome, there are some studies showing they have some minor benefit for some people. Mm-hmm. But again, we never know which one to suggest because all the studies are done with different species.
Yeah.
And all of our microbes in our gut are very different. So you and I are not going to have at all the same microbes. Why would we respond to exactly the same medicine? So I think the future is evolving as we start to get maybe personalised advice on probiotics. So always try food first. If you do have some symptoms, they're worth a try,
right.
but try different ones and always try and get a supplier that you trust because
right.
there are big problems of them actually not containing what they're supposed to.
I did see one study at UCL, I don't know if it was a while ago, where most of them didn't actually get past the stomach, which I don't know if that's, I mean, is there...
No, I think the consensus is that enough get past the acid in the stomach to actually work, just like fermented foods. But
right.
As I said, I'd rather take your probiotic as a kefir or a kombucha
right. Okay.
or a yogurt because you know it gets through, you know it's natural, and we know from recent studies that if you have lots of fermented foods, even for 2 weeks for people who haven't had it, you can really boost your immune system and reduce inflammation. So I'd go with the tried and tested ones before going to these. And some of them do have some trials. There are some brands that are much better than others. And there are some studies now showing they work quite well in depression. And so before reaching for antidepressants, people should think about their diet and getting rid of ultra-processed foods, maybe trying high-fibre diets, plus or minus probiotics.
Interesting. So one question that's just recently come in is from Victoria asking, any tips on what we should eat first thing in the morning to make sure we set up our gut microbes for the day? We're all individuals, so some people wake up hungry, most people don't wake up hungry. I think it's more important to make sure you've got a good fast. So the only thing that is pretty proven first thing in the morning to be good for your gut microbes is a black coffee or perhaps a green tea, as we've discussed. I would then have a late breakfast, and some people we know from the Zoe studies have a very good response to sugars. They don't get a really big peak, they don't get a dip that makes them hungry. They can have a healthy high fibre muesli or something they make themselves, or they can have sourdough bread. That's fine for them, but for me, I get a terrible big sugar peak if I have that or I have oats. Yeah. And for me, which I was told was a healthy food, oat porridge, really bad, really high sugar peak. So I have a really fatty breakfast with my black coffee. What's your fatty breakfast? It's
full fat Greek yogurt with my magic seed and nut mix and a few berries I might have got from the freezer. Blackberries if they're in season, or frozen blueberries or whatever it is. And that's generally my breakfast. On the weekend I might have avocado toast on a bit of rye sourdough, sprinkled again with a few more nuts and seeds and some exotic spices. But I think everyone's got to practice themselves and work out what it is. And that's what people who do the Zoe program do. They work out, are they a carb person, a fat person, and then try to work around what combination of foods suit them. But only a few people can actually do this without the sugar testing.
Right, but you think some people can listen to their
Some
bodies?
people are quite attuned to their bodies. I'm not, but you know, there are some people that at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning do feel that low, that sugar dip, if they've had a carby breakfast.
Yeah, I definitely do. If I have porridge rather than, I mean, one thing I wanted to ask about was eggs. We do love our eggs for breakfast, and personally, I like eggs for breakfast. But
Nothing wrong with eggs.
Okay.
All the epidemiology studies, the big population studies, show that up to about, you know, 1 egg a day, you know, around 7 a week is fine.
Okay.
I think if you have if you're up on sort of 20 eggs, then I think you do run some problems. But the idea that eggs are bad for you because they're, you know, fatty and whatever is nonsense.
Okay, so we've got a lot of subscriber questions. So I don't know if we can just run through a few quick fire questions. So we've already covered off coffee, which was one of them. Stuart is asking, are the probiotic drinks better than normal yogurt? Like, and I think he means maybe those little jars, little shots, rather than kefir. Obviously kefir is, but
we don't really know.
We don't know. Okay.
So I think things like Yakult and whatever, they have been shown to have definite live microbes in them. So they might be one up, but they're in a sort of category. They're probably helpful, but again, you might have to just try and see for yourself because they always have the same species in them.
Right. Michelle is asking, red meat, friend or foe?
In moderation, in small amounts, red meat is perfectly fine for your gut microbes as long as you've got the other plants with you. As long as it doesn't take up the whole plate,
Right.
you've got plenty of room. The caveat for that, it's terrible for the planet.
Right, yeah.
So the biggest thing, if you want to reduce climate change, you can do is to reduce your red meat consumption.
Jenny is asking about alcohol. Does it kill our good gut bacteria?
A bottle of vodka will definitely kill off your good
Probably
bacteria.
kill you as well.
Yes, and so most alcohol is bad for your gut microbes, but there are some exceptions, and moderate amounts, 1 to 2 glasses at most of red wine, for example, is good because it's a plant.
Yeah.
It's got the
Sort of
grapes in it.
polyphenols, is it?
It's got the polyphenols in the grape skin.
But 2 glasses? 2 big glasses or 2 small glasses?
No, 2 British big glasses, probably too much. But again, it's individualised. We don't yet know what that dose is for everybody, so I'm giving general advice. But 1 generally is pretty safe. But things like artisan cider are also looking like they're going to be good. They're high in polyphenols.
What about beer?
And some beers, if they've got lots of natural ingredients and might not be too bad, but I wouldn't yet class them as health drinks.
Okay.
So we're sort of looking at this space. But for the moment, red wine and cider.
Okay, so another thing, we've had quite a lot of specific health questions coming in from our subscribers. Lots of people, we've spoken about IBS and constipation and bloating, but another thing that's come up quite often, Mariam is asking about the perimenopause and can a good microbiome help?
Absolutely, yes. We've got some recent research here that we did with Zoe, and we had about 40,000 women going through the menopause. This is partly as we're doing the COVID data collection, and show that the quality of the diet is, in this big set, was one of the major factors in symptoms at the menopause, and as was things like weight as well. So overweight women who are on poor diets did really badly going through the menopause, and you could mitigate that with a good diet that was high in fibre, that was gut friendly.
Right.
This is association studies. We haven't done a trial, but it's very big numbers. And in the PREDICT study, where we looked at 1,000 women very carefully, we saw that as you go through the menopause, you get higher sugar spikes and fat peaks than just before. So it explains why women put on weight at the menopause, because their body's reacting more to the same foods because of the lack of estrogen. And this is mitigated by the gut microbes. So women who have a good gut health get less of a sugar spike, less symptoms. So the quick answer is yes.
Yes. And less of a sugar spike, less symptoms, is that also less weight gain? Is that sort of
yes.
right? Yeah. And how about with osteoporosis? That's a question from Alan. Is that something that our gut microbes can help with or help prevent?
Probably, but there's not good evidence that it's a major factor, different to aging. So we think generally there's very good evidence that maintaining your gut microbes reduces the rate of aging, and of course osteoporosis is a classical thing where you lose your bone mass as you age, so along with your muscle mass.
Right.
So your microbes, in ways we still don't understand, help you maintain that.
So this leads into a question from Penny, who is asking, I'm in my 60s, should I be eating differently from how I was in my 40s and 50s?
Yes, is the answer,
Really?
because of the effect of the menopause. Foods that you're able to eat very easily without any inflammation or problems could be problematic for you now. So
what kind of things?
Well,
Not just we're not talking about UPFs, we're talking like
no,
real foods.
You know, some women were quite able to eat croissants, for example, without having any bad effects of it when they were 40, but as you go through the menopause, you get an extra 50% of a sugar peak or a fat peak with that croissant. That means your inflammation level's going up. So I think
when you say inflammation levels, what do you mean?
Stress on the body.
Right.
These are chemicals in the blood that are like you're just lighting a little fire in your blood vessels, and so it's just simmering along, which, inflammation helps us stay alive and fight infection, but if it's there, when it should have burnt out, it's not good for our system. So this is why we want to cut out these sugar and fat spikes.
Yeah.
So we don't know all the answers yet, but I think it's important that people do reevaluate their diet every 5 or 10 years, because your body is constantly changing, and that's why we have to not just sit with something that we've always done, and it's about experimenting yourself and find out what works for you.
Okay. So Tim, we've heard what you eat for breakfast already, and I'm sorry to do this to you, but can you run through typically what you eat in a day? Lunch, dinner, snacks?
Today,
Yeah.
I didn't have breakfast, apart from my black coffee, and I did have some Earl Grey tea. And I had lunch, which was my leftover dinner from last night, which was a beetroot and bean chili. And I just had a bowl of that, heated it up, and that was my lunch. But in a way, my lunch is always different. If I'm struggling on the go in the hospital, if I'm in a hospital where there's often nothing really good to eat, I would just go for a couple of pieces of fruit and some mixed nuts. And that would, whereas I used to have a sandwich.
Right.
So I know that sandwiches are deadly for me, even if they look healthy.
Yeah.
They're terrible. And I no longer have orange juice. Used to love it, but I know that is really bad for me. I don't have smoothies, and I just stick to my kombuchas, my coffees, and my water. So yeah, rather boring. And then in the evening, I would have usually a vegetarian meal. I use these meal boxes.
Oh, do you? Okay.
So I use the Riverford meal box, but I've used all of them because it's organic, but there's lots of them. And I find for people who are trying to eat less meat, trying to get into vegetarian cooking, they're a great way to educate you.
Because they give you recipes as well.
You get all the ingredients, all the recipes. You don't have to go shopping, and it also teaches you all the things you can do with plants in ways that gets you out of a rut. So I'd thoroughly recommend people who want to do this, don't know how to. It's often the sort of click button approach that it worked for me anyway. So
finally, we've got a question from Kate, which are, what would the top 3 things be that you would do for your gut health? What are your top 3 tips?
Well, we've sort of discussed it, but it's to recap. It's have as many different plants as you can every week. It's I'd really give fermented foods a chance, and in multiple shots. So, don't try and have a whole pint of yogurt or whatever. It's the small amounts that count, giving you those different microbes every day, and start experimenting with things you haven't done. So the kimchis, pickled vegetables, and even Japanese foods. We haven't talked about those, misos and tempehs, and the fermented tofu. And I think the third thing is, give your gut a rest, and how you eat is absolutely as important. Just every time you eat, realise that with 100 trillion bacteria in there, you're never going to be eating alone.
Well, I think that brings our event to a close this evening. Thank you, Tim, for sharing your wisdom, and for all the subscribers who have joined us this evening. This session will be available to watch back from tomorrow on our Telegraph Extra channel if you're keen to listen again. But for now, thank you for joining us, and good night.